Scott Young, I'm so happy to have you on. You have no idea.
Well, it's very flattering. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I just read your book, Ultralearning, and I mean, it's done well, obviously, but I'm so surprised it's not right next to The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck or Atomic Habits in every bookstore.
That's a great compliment. I think I think a lot of people who, to your point, don't realize how many books have been published. So I've just been very grateful that it's managed to rise up of a level where I can have conversations like this one. The amount of books that reach that tiny little sliver at the top is small, but I'm just happy that some people who've read it have enjoyed it.
Yeah, many books have been published, but I don't think many great books have been published. I don't know. I'm thinking somehow maybe all those books, like the Subtle Art, maybe that has just an excellent marketing team behind it. I don't know, but I really could see, I know your book was published a few years ago, but I could really see it
I think you also have to put yourself in the shoes of the average book reader too, because Ultralearning has a little bit of it's going to be enticing to some people, but it's also going to be like, woo, that sounds like much. I don't want to get into that. So I definitely have that. I'm aware of that ambivalence. Something like Atomic Habits, it's nice and gentle. Sometimes it works a little bit better to pick in the kind of, this might be some nice beach reading. Ultralearning doesn't feel like beach reading. Maybe that's my problem. You feel like, oh man, he's going to ask me to do some stuff. I don't know whether I want to read this.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Ultralearning is it's like a lifestyle change. It's yeah.
Well, I mean, I didn't come up with the term. This was Cal Newport who titled a guest post I did with this term, and it kind of stuck after that. But I always liked it because it sort of, to me, likens it to, people who run ultra marathons and stuff, where it's sort of this is kind of too intense. This is something a normal person wouldn't do. But, if you're interested in that and you're learning from it, you can extract some advice from there. So I think that's maybe part of the persona that I put forth in the book, and some of the people I interview, they're kind of weird and unusual and intense. But I think if you can extract the lessons for it, you can do things that are not necessarily quite so crazy and still beneficial. It's still something that it matters to you for your life.
That's true. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's how I interpreted it too. So just for the audiences, just for clarity, can you go into a little bit about what Ultralearning is and what you do?
Sure. So, I mean, the way I defined it in the book is it's intensive self-directed learning. So when you can think about that, if you think a little quadrant where you have self-directed versus, not self-directed or other-directed, and then you have intensive or not intensive. So you can think of someone who is just learning, painting for fun, and they're just kind of dabbling and doing whatever, and it's just to make it fun. That's not really that intensive. And then you have the medical school student who's studying really hard, but is in an extremely structured program where it's just do this homework, do this assignment, study for this test. And so there's not a lot of decision making about should I learn this? Should I learn that? How should I practice? And so the idea was to focus on people who learned difficult skills in ways that were sort of unconventional, self-directed. And so that's how I define it. So with that definition, that encompasses a lot of people, maybe whether or not you would think of them as ultra learners. But throughout the book too, I also feature individual stories of people who did things that inspired me, that I thought was really impressive, like Steve Pavlina getting a degree in 3 semesters, or Benny Lewis speaking 12 languages, or Eric Barone making a video game, art, music, programming, everything all by himself. So people like this that I thought were, interesting. And if you could kind of dive into their process, what is it that they're doing differently that might be useful to someone who wants to learn something, even if it's not quite as intense or quite as ambitious.
It's interesting because while there is that, I first heard about you when you talked about, you published an article about learning calculus in a week. It was a week, right?
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah. So this was sort of in the build up to this MIT Challenge project. I was trying to do a class in around a week's time frame. So yeah.
But when I was reading your book, it didn't seem to me I just personally, I don't think I have the capacity, at least at this point in time, to sit down for 8 hours a day and learn that hard. But I just felt like this was a great guidebook for me to figure out how to spend half an hour to an hour a day, just like learning in the best way possible. Like, and I think that's pretty achievable for the average person, especially if you work up to it.
Well, I definitely think when you look at a lot of the research on effective studying and this kind of stuff, I would say like there's an efficiency dimension and then there's a kind of intensiveness dimension. So the efficiency dimension would be like how useful is the time you're spending studying? And it turns out there's like a wide range of activities, and our intuitions about what works for learning don't always match up with what's particularly effective. So you can spend a lot of time doing something, some particular activity. Like one of the things I talk about in the book is like rereading your notes or something that just feels like studying. It's work and it's related to what you're trying to learn. That isn't very efficient. And then there's more efficient studying, so that, you know, whether you did it for 8 hours a day or you did it for 20 minutes a day, it would still be better than something else you'd be doing for 20 minutes. So we talk about retrieval practice, a bunch of other things in the book too. And so that's the sort of efficiency dimension. And then the intensiveness dimension is kind of more like, well, is this something you're trying to, you know, get really good at within a couple of weeks? Or is this something that, you know, you're trying to stretch out over a couple of years, maybe just little dollops of time? And so I do think that one reason I like to focus on people who did these intensive projects is that if you're doing a project over a very short time frame, it's kind of the proof's in the pudding sort of thing. Like it's very difficult to get good at something in a very short time frame if you weren't efficient in some ways. Whereas, you know, if you're looking at the span over 10 years, I mean, most people aren't carefully, meticulously tracking how much time they spend. So it's harder to tell whether someone who spent 10 years doing something, whether they did it in a particularly efficient way or not.
One of the really impressive things that you've done is learn a language. You learned 4 languages, I believe. It took you 3 months to learn a language. So can you talk about how you did that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. So this was one of the projects I talked about in the book. And so this language learning project, it was my friend and I, we went on a trip. And so we spent 3 months in 4 different countries, Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea. And the goal was when we would land in the country, we would try to only speak in the language we were trying to learn. So when we landed in Spain, we would only speak in Spanish. If we were in China, we'd only speak in Mandarin. And the idea was to like see how far we could get with each of the languages. So I'm always a little hesitant to say learned X because it implies this state of completion, like, oh, after 3 months, I'd learned everything there was about Mandarin or Korean. And then someone who's, you know, spent 20 years is like, wait a minute. But I think to the person who has maybe not learned another language fluently before, and like even to the point where they could have basic conversations in it, I think the experience I had with this project, and from seeing Benny Lewis, who is the inspiration for it, who's done this many times before, is that people are often surprised that if you go through this sort of intensive immersion process, how much you actually can do after 3 months, you know, especially if your intuition about learning a language is that like, well, I spent, you know, 5 years doing it in high school and I can't do anything, then it seems kind of intuitively like, oh, well, you know, would you be able to order coffee or get directions at a restaurant? Whereas, you know, we were living in Spain and we had friends and we were like had social lives and everything that you would have in your normal life just in Spanish instead of in English. And so that was a project that we did. So I've learned to varying degrees. I've learned those 4 languages, and I've also learned I learned French before. This was a sort of a prior experience to this project, and then since then I've also learned a bit of Macedonian, which is my wife's native language. So I have a little project about that on the website too. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. I think I had a thought and then it just dropped away. So I will, you talked about, sorry, did you call it retrieval?
Yeah, retrieval practice.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, could you tell us more about retrieval learning?
Yeah, so I mean, retrieval is basically the idea of trying to remember something when it's not right in front of you. So a good example of that would be free recall, which is just like, okay, trying to write down or remember everything you can say about a particular topic. So, you know, if you were to do free recall on this podcast right now, you'd pause it and be like, you know, what was everything I can remember from this podcast? As opposed to like a test, let's say, where they're giving you the questions and you have to give the answers. And what research has found is that an act of retrieval tends to be worth more than an act of review in terms of your eventual memory. So if you're studying for a test, they found in many situations, that if you are trying to retain information for the test, actually keeping the book closed and trying to recall what was in the book is often more beneficial than reading it again. And so the kind of paradox of this is that when you ask students, like, how well do you think you've learned the material? People who do the retrieval practice think they haven't learned it very well because, it's difficult. You try to, I don't remember anything from this. But when you actually test them on it, the people who did the retrieval practice do much better on the test. So this is one of those situations where our intuitions about learning can be deceiving because what actually works and what feels like it works are not the same. And so this was a big principle that I talked about in the book because retrieval practice features prominently in people's efforts to get good at a lot of skills. And it's something that's often conspicuously missing from, people who are trying to, pass tests or even like giving speeches, for instance. Like how many people, like they're looking at their flashcards or their little cue cards, what they have to say over and over and over again when they're rehearsing, when if you want to memorize it, you've got to put them away, try to recall, and then if you fail, then you can look at the cards, and that actually works a lot better. So this is just one little tip, but it's a principle that undergirds successful learning.
What fascinated me in the book when you were talking about retrieval was it's one of the best ways to study for a test is to do test questions. I believe it was do test questions even if you don't know the answers. And then, and correct me if I'm wrong here, and then because I loved your metaphor for this. It like builds a bridge to the place you want to go, or a road to the place you want to go before you've gone there yet. And so, that's so interesting because I'm looking through test questions and then later on I find out the answers, but somehow the act of putting in the effort and thinking about it, reinforces learning somehow. I mean, it just seems like...
Well, I think... I think you can go overboard on that. You can get to a place where it's sort of like, okay, well, I don't have any material to study from. I'm just going to try to answer the questions. And if you don't get feedback, if you don't get that kind of thing, it's probably not that helpful. But I think where this kind of technique can be beneficial in the right place is that by going through the questions before you review the material, it changes how also you process the material. Because if you know what kinds of questions they're asking, it changes what details you focus on. So when you read a passage, like this is one of the old classic psychology results, but what you pay attention to in materials that you are processing, what you pay attention to ends up being what you remember. So there's this classic called levels of processing effect, where if you get people to, let's say, go through a list of words and ask themselves, which ones have the letter E in the word? And then you ask some people, okay, which words are pleasant? Well, the first thing focuses you on the sort of visual form of the word, and the second thing focuses on the meaning of the word. And it turns out if you ask people to remember the words later, the people who had the deeper processing remember it a lot better. Now, this goes just beyond this sort of depth of processing, but basically whatever you're kind of, how you're filtering the information, what you're looking for affects what you remember. So if you see some questions and see what kinds of questions they're asking, it does kind of cue you to like think about it like, oh, this is the blank that I'm trying to fill when you're processing it. So I think going through questions can often be very beneficial. And I think that's particularly true. It's particularly true with subjects where it's not often clear what kinds of things you ought to be remembering from something. So I do think doing the test first is often a good it's a good warm-up exercise, Maybe don't spend tons and tons of time on it if you don't know any of the answers, but if you're not entirely sure what the answers are, it can often be beneficial to get a look at the questions first.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I guess I kind of assumed that was implied that you have to actually learn the answers at some point. But it's very good to tell people because someone out there might not have like consciously thought of that. It seems to me very apparent that difficulty is a huge part of learning. Like the passive listening to lectures that we have, reading a textbook, it's oftentimes, I mean, I'm sure there's ways to engage with a textbook really deeply and connect with it emotionally and stuff like that. But generally it seems like, I mean, one of the core principles of your work is that you just need to be like fully engaged with, mentally with the subject.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the difficulties with learning a lot of things is that our brains are kind of effort avoidance machines. So learning is kind of inherently effortful. It's doing something that's not the default response or the default answer. And so our brain is trying to conserve its sort of limited resources and only invest it in the right places. And so doing things like testing, like we were talking about retrieval, is so beneficial because it's also a signal to the brain, like, I need to remember this, right? Because I've experienced some attempt to recall it. And that strengthens it more in the future. And similarly for lots of skills, I mean, you need to practice them quite a bit in order to make them sort of a part of your repertoire. Languages, I think, are probably the best example of that, where the classroom approach where you say, okay, here's a grammar pattern, and then you do a few exercises. Here's another grammar pattern. Here's a few exercises. I recall, I think it was my sister who was taking like a college level Spanish class, and the way that they had divided the class was there were like, I don't know, like 18 weeks or something in the class. And so it was like each week was a new conjugation, like as if like 1 week per conjugate, like then the language would be learned, like this kind of thing. Whereas people who actually become fluent in languages, it's not that you do have to cover all the conjugations, but you're getting tons and tons and tons of repetitions doing the language, speaking, actually trying to communicate. And that makes those patterns, which seem really awkward and difficult when you're doing them in the textbook, that makes them so automatic that you don't even think about them and you become fluent. That's what fluency is that it just comes out automatically. And so that's something that's often missing, I think, in a lot of classroom practices, that there's this desire to cover a large body of material. There's not enough time to actually really practice it, so you don't learn it that deeply. You just kind of have this very kind of superficial understanding of it.
I'm a musician, and so I'm really interested. Like I like to improvise on guitar a lot. And now after reading your book, I'm like, oh, I need to do this. I need to like spend a week doing like a songwriting intensive. Like one of the things I like most about your book is how inspiring it is. Like I read it and I was like, oh, I need to like plan out, just a time crunch and just like do as much as I possibly can. And I was wondering, one thing I was wondering is like, do you ever do multiple ultra learning experiences at once, or do you usually condense them down into like one at a time?
Well, I'm very much a kind of one at a time sort of person, and maybe that's some of that's my hardwiring, that like I have a hard time juggling projects perhaps, or maybe I'm just sort of an obsessive person. If you haven't noticed by some of the projects, I have an obsessive personality, so maybe that's also part of that. So I don't want to draw too universal a rule here, but I do think there is a tendency, I think, to for there to be a gap between the kind of the idea of doing something and the reality of doing it. And the idea of doing these projects is often, you're thinking of some great result you're going to get in some short period of time, and there's a certain romanticism about it. So it's like, what if I did learn French, or what if I became an excellent painter, or learned jujitsu, or learn programming, and then you're doing it and you're kind of like, oh man, this is hard, there's so many things, how do you remember all this? And so I think that kind of contrast can often be a case where it's easy to have like 6 or 7 different ideas about like, well, I'll also do this, I'll also do this, I'll also do this, but then not actually do them. And so I think for me, I feel like the having one at a time, and if you feel like there are 3 or 4 things you really want to learn, chunking them down so you do like, a month on something and a month on something else, it does discipline a certain amount of like, okay, well, this is what I have to focus on right now, rather than, sort of rushing off to some other idea of something rather than actually doing it.
It seems like you have some excellent techniques, and this book is full of techniques, but there's this hurdle for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people, of overcoming that. I think you said the brain is an energy conservation machine, like overcoming that energy conservation hurdle. And I think for me, even organizing my life, like my life is a bit, I wouldn't say haphazard, but like I have a lot of things coming on that I do on short notice, right? And so like organizing my time, I find a little bit difficult. So I wonder, like, I guess those were 2 separate questions, but I wonder how you structure your life in order to I mean, I'm sure you obviously have your blog. I'm sure you have a lot of things going on. Like as you get bigger in the world, you have more responsibility. So I'm wondering how you organize your life to accommodate for so much ultra learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big question. I do think like my life has changed. Like a lot of these projects I did were when I was younger. Now I have 2 kids and I have a business. So certainly the like, okay, I'm going to work on this full time for a year is
kids.
probably not my current MO. Yeah. Okay. Papa's going to go do some ultra learning now. I'll talk to you later. No, it's not like that. But I do like, I still read a lot of books. I still do a lot of learning projects. They tend to be more on the end of, okay, here's something that's important that I want to learn and I'm going to fit it into my life rather than how can I do it in the most, theatrical way possible so that when I'm writing about it, it looks impressive or it looks interesting. And so I think one of the things that I think is really important is working on projects that you do find very interesting. And so, I mean, there's obviously people, you're going to be in situations in life where you have to learn X, right? And you're in some forcing function, which is pushing you to learn that. And I think there's lots of good studying advice in this book about that too. So I'm not trying to disregard that. But I think most people are not in those situations. So if you're outside of a stressful exam type situation in school, doing a self-directed learning project is almost never required. Even if it's beneficial for you, even if it's something that could move your career forward, it's never like, well, if you don't learn Python, then your job as a whatever is going to be over. Probably not, And so I think picking projects where you have some core of like enthusiasm about it, they're like, oh, I'm really interested in this, or I'd really like to do this, or I've always wanted to do this. I think that's very important. And then the other thing I think is that you have to kind of learn to start loving the process of doing the work as well. So it's a little bit like, I think it's a little bit like working out or exercise in that way, that I think if you like the idea of being really in shape, but like you detest running, then like, building up to a marathon, you're never going to get there, right? Because you hate the process so much. So you have to like running, or you have to like doing whatever it is that you have to do to get there. And so I think those are both parts. And for me, the ultra learning kind of idea is that, well, if you are really interested in something and you do like the process of learning, then it's very natural to just ask yourself like, well, how could you do it better? How could you optimize it? Or how could you make it work? So I think it's important not to contrast like the efficient learning technique with the enjoyable learning techniques, because I think they go together. That when you really enjoy doing something, when it's not a chore, when it's something you're excited about, then you want to do it efficiently. It's when you kind of hate doing something that you're looking for like the easiest way to do it, and you don't care about whether it's efficient or not. So I think finding those projects that really interest you, finding that thing that like, yeah, you don't mind just like, okay, I've got an extra half hour, I'll work on it right now. Like those are the ones that I think you're going to make the most distance with in getting better at.
What's coming up for me is like one thing I'm struggling with recently is just filling up all my time with social media. Like Reddit for me seems to be like it's my crack. So like every time I have a spare like 5 minutes or half an hour, I'm usually on Reddit, and I've realized like, oh, I need to first of all learn to be bored again. But also just like find, replace it with Enki decks or something. I wonder if you have any experience with dealing with. Oh yeah,
definitely. This. I'm someone who's like, if like, I don't know, social media addiction or something was the thing. Like I'm the person is like, hi, my name is Scott. I'm because I used to be that person. I used to be on Reddit and Twitter all the time. I think part of it is also the justifications. Like when you're an online person, you're making online content. You're like, well, this is important research. I got to stay on. It's like journalists being like, well, I have to be on Twitter, otherwise, how would I do my job? I think that's not true of a lot of people. So there is definitely like there's a bit self-serving to say it that way. But I think part of it is that a lot of these algorithms, they're kind of giving people what they want at scale, and what people want is just sort of newness. And so these social media sites are like really these Skinner boxes with variable reinforcement schedules. So like you pull the lever and most of the time nothing comes out, but sometimes a rat pellet comes out and you get really excited. And so you keep pulling. And so I don't know. For me, the thing that ended up working was just not being on social media. That sounds like an extreme solution, but I just found that even a lot of the stuff I was doing where, setting time limits and barricading. It would always end up breaking down whatever barricade I had. So it's like, okay, my Twitter's half an hour a day. I'm done my half an hour. And then, something would happen and that habit would go away. But a couple years ago, I decided, you know what, I'm going to just go off of it for a while, and I just found it was better. And so what I do right now is, because I still like to read and consume a lot of online media, is I use RSS readers, which is kind of an outdated technology, but use like Feedly or something like this, and you can subscribe to individual channels, individual things, and they will give you that content. But then when you're done, there's nothing more. There's no endless things to look at, and I find that to be a good compromise, because there's lots of stuff that I think is really beneficial to read and consume. I think the thing that I didn't like about the experience was the Skinner box feeling, where you the content's not good anymore, but you keep pulling on it because what else are you going to do? And then you don't have any time to, learn anything or read a book or spend time with your kids or whatever it is that you want to do.
Yeah. Spend time with your kids as soon there must be so many parents out there, and I'm not a parent, but there must be a lot of parents out there who are on social media all the time around kids. And I do wonder if that, there are much worse things you can do for your kids. Obviously it's not the end of the world. But even for a personal thing, even when I'm around family or friends, sometimes I go on social media and it's there's a little bit of removing the humanness out of these interactions. Even just sitting in silence with people.
I think you raised a good point that you kind of have to relearn how to be bored a little bit. But part of it is that, these things are giving us kind of what we want at a very instinctual level. And so I think, I frequently collaborate with Cal Newport, who is, he's an early adopter of the anti-social media train. But I think, now everyone's sort of coming around to the opinion that he's had since 2008 or whatever. But the feeling I have is a little bit less extreme. I do think that, there's definitely people who maybe either what their goals are, what they want to do, being on Twitter all the time is fine, right? So I'm not trying to be overly judgmental about it. But I think for yourself, you just have to kind of evaluate your own relationship with this kind of media and just ask yourself, is this what I want to be spending my time on? And if it's yes, then great. I have no judgment. But if you'd rather be, I don't read any books anymore. I'd rather read a book or two, and I find it hard to do because it's just way easier to be on TikTok, then, maybe you have to consider some of your habits in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, have you managed to engineer some sort of Skinner box type thing into your Ultralearning?
Well, there is a lot of people that are kind of interested in that kind of thing. So gamification is a real popular sort of tool of how do we take, studying is boring. How do we make it more fun? And I think it does work to a certain extent. If you've tried to learn a language, Duolingo is, crazy popular. Almost anyone you ask them, oh, you're learning a language, you're using Duolingo. And why? Because there's a little talking parrot who gives you gemstones if you move around some words. Now, I was quite critical of Duolingo in my book, and I think I'm still not a huge fan of Duolingo. I think I've softened a little maybe in my old age, but I feel like part of the difficulty is that it's very gamification is kind of fragile, because I think that when you are trying to take kind of an unpleasant activity and then sort of dress it up and stuff, it's very easy to evolve it into some activity that is no longer serving its original function. And so yes, maybe you've made it more entertaining, but maybe you've also made it inert or kind of useless. And that was my feeling a little bit about Duolingo, is that I know people who have done Duolingo for a year and they could not have a conversation. And I'm critical sometimes of formal classes for learning languages, but definitely if you took a year's worth of a class and you were studying, you'd probably be able to use it, whereas Duolingo is kind of questionable whether you would even be able to do that. And so it sort of raises a point, what was the point of that year of doing Duolingo? Well, if it was just to have a game on your phone, then yeah, maybe it's better than playing those bubble swap games or something. At least you probably learned a few words. But I'm questioning whether or not, if you were actually serious about learning French or Spanish or this kind of thing, if you would not have been better off with an approach where, maybe it is more work and it is more intense and you have to set aside a little bit of time, but, after a couple months, you are having little conversations. And if you travel to Paris, you actually can order the, cafe in the restaurant and stuff. And this is sort of what I get to in ultralearning, is I think that sometimes the efforts to do something that's related to the topic actually undermine the passion for learning, because you're kind of doing these actions in a way that's totally divorced from whether or not they work, whether or not they're efficient. And because of that, maybe you don't make that much progress, but you kind of justify it to yourself as like, well, I'm doing something and learning is really hard. Whereas if you did something that worked really well and you made progress, then maybe you'd actually be able to use that skill and just sort of get into a cycle where using it would just improve your ability. Excuse me.
I really liked what you said in the book about Duolingo, because it totally, I've been doing a little bit of Duolingo and it absolutely resonated with me. Like in Duolingo, you have a sentence in English and then you have to like recognize the words and then put them in the right order in the other language. And when speaking to a person in another language, that never happens. That's not a common occurrence. This goes back to one of your principles in the book, which is like practice for what you're actually going to be doing. If you want to learn a foreign language,
sorry.
Sorry.
I was just
going to say like,
interrupting you.
No worries. I was going to say, for me, like setting time aside to talk to someone in a foreign language has been probably the most helpful for me.
Oh yeah, definitely. My feeling from this language learning project is that, there's a lot of like theoretical arguments. I've just been reading a lot of books about like second language acquisition and theories people have and all. And so it's very interesting intellectually, but like my feeling from personal experience is that if you were to say to someone, okay, for, the next half hour, we're only going to speak in this language, and you were to just repeat that activity, that would get you to I would say like an intermediate conversational level in almost any language, perhaps with a little bit of help with some other languages. I think if you were doing a more difficult, let's say Asian language, or a language where, you have a lot of difficulty with the grammar or pronunciation, doing the drills, the classroom stuff is still helpful. I don't want to discount that. But I think that basic kind of interaction, that practice, it does so many things for you. So you have to retrieve the words, you have to generate them. So that means that you have to remember them much better than if you're just passively listening to them. You have to interact with someone. So the other person has to give you conversational input, which is a really important part of language acquisition. And it's an input that's at your level because they're adjusting their conversation to you. And you have this dialogue with them and you acquire new words, you acquire new vocabulary. And sometimes it's not enough. Like I talk a lot about like flashcards and doing grammar drills and other things in the book too. So there's always the optimizing of that basic interaction. But I think if you were to have basic interaction and sustain it over a long period of time, you would at least be conversationally fluid. Whether you would reach the highest levels of language ability from that alone, I don't think so, but it would give you the basics. Whereas I tend to think that for a lot of language tools and apps, unless you sort of take them beyond what most people are doing with them, you're not going to get there, or you're not going to get there with any reasonable time frame. So Duolingo, I think, it's with credit to the designers, I think they faced some enormous challenges with making it. And one of them is that in a language, there's often multiple ways you can express the same idea that is valid, but a computer isn't often good at doing that. Like it has one way that it wants you to say it, and so you have to say it that way. And so, it's really annoying when you like type something in and you like, do something that's a close paraphrase and then it gives you the wrong answer and you feel bad. So that's why they do the drag and drop, just because it avoids this technical hurdle. But it turns out that, you're doing this drag and dropping is, maybe it's okay at the very beginning if it's like really, really way too hard to do everything else. Doing that at the start is helpful, but at some point you have to not have the words there and have to be able to retrieve them, and that's just what's missing for most people using those applications. And so I think that's one of those things that, like, when I think about the average person who wants to learn a language, or at least wants to learn it enough that they've downloaded Duolingo and started practicing it, would that person be better off playing Duolingo whenever they have 5 minutes of time that's gamified? Or would they be better being like, you know what, I'm going to sit down and do this language lesson, and yeah, I have to take time out of my schedule, and yeah, it's effortful, and yeah, this kind of thing. But, I stick to it for a while and I can actually have these like maybe short, brief interactions, but it's something that I wouldn't have been able to say with that other application. And so that's sort of my criticism of Duolingo. So I'm sure the Duolingo founders are making enough money from all their app downloads, so they don't need to worry about criticism by me. But I do think that that's something that's generally true, that if you are really serious about learning something, the efficiency and enjoyment go together. They're not necessarily like, oh, well, I have to make this really unpleasant thing more enjoyable, or I have to make this efficient thing, like they go together because you care about actually getting the outcome. And so it's sort of instrumental to want to work on it that way.
Yes. I like what you said though about Duolingo having a place instead of a game on your phone. Like if I have a spare for 5 minutes and I'm waiting for something, I might as well just take out Duolingo, or Anki Dex might be better, right? But like, if that's fun,
I think Anki Dex would be better, but I mean, we can get into the nuances of that.
For sure. But like, there's also this, I think there's value to having something be fun and easy that you can kind of just do passively, like to entertain yourself. Whereas like Anki Dex, it might just be like a slightly higher hurdle. Like I think Duolingo seems to have it has a place, I think, even in like reminding yourself to keep up the motivation with the language, But I totally agree. Like,
well, this is an interesting thing. This is an interesting point you're making, because I think this is how a lot of people see it. And I don't want to be, too much of the wet blanket here. But I think that,
please do.
But I think my feeling, and this sort of goes to this point, is that, okay, let's say you accept my premise that you don't think Duolingo is particularly effective. Like, we can have a separate debate about what it's good for, what it's not good for, this kind of thing. But let's say you just accept this is not the most efficient way of doing it, and I probably need to be doing something else to actually learn this language. Say you accept my point there. Then I think it's interesting to ask, like, what is the motivational effect of doing Duolingo? And so I think there's two possible things that could happen. One is that Duolingo is facilitating. So you spend a little bit of time doing Duolingo, and so that just raises the salience of this language, makes it more likely that you'll be willing to do any other thing. So it has a kind of facilitating effect. It's a complement in economics terms. The other alternative is that it's a substitute. The other alternative is that by doing Duolingo, you kind of slake your, I wanted to do something language learning related thirst, and then you don't do something else. In which case, if it's a substitute, you're probably better having the game, because then if you actually wanted to learn French, you're going to do something that's maybe more beneficial, more effective for learning French. So I think it is an open empirical question whether activities like this are on the whole substitutes or on the whole complements, but I can definitely envision scenarios where they are substitutes. I can definitely envision scenarios where you doing this thing that is like checks the box mentally in your head does inhibit you from putting in more work to something that you might have done. And I think there's a real question too, like, it depends on how effective it is. If we're talking about this is like, 90% as effective as the most effective thing, but it's way more fun, then yeah, okay, that makes sense. But if it's like 1% as effective, then I think the substitution complement thing, you just can't ignore it, because if it's substituting for what it is that you really should be doing, then it creates more problems. And so I think part of, again, going to this ultralearning, and my previous point I was making about like finding something that you actually really care about learning well as being the central thing, I think that's sometimes it's useful to force that decision of like, do I really care about getting better at this? And it's okay to say no. It's okay to say like, no, I actually don't really care about getting better at this. In which case, you can do Duolingo if you genuinely think Duolingo is fun, but maybe don't feel guilty about not practicing at all if you don't really care about it. But if you do care about it, then I think that does invite that question of what you want to work on. So we were talking about Duolingo and like kind of using up these like little 5-minute slices that maybe you can't schedule a conversation. I do think there's some validity there. I think there is some places where, a really effective studying session is just kind of onerous. Like you have to spend like an hour doing it and you just can't fit it into your schedule. But I think for the language learning case in particular, I don't think that's true. I think there are things that you could fit into the space that Duolingo takes. They would be more effortful, maybe a little bit less gamified than Duolingo, but they would probably work better. So my classic example is that like just doing flashcards for vocabulary is not enough to speak a language, but it forces recall. And so you'd actually know quite a few words. So if you were to practice, I think it would work better than a drag and drop exercise where there's very little recall. That would be my opinion. I haven't seen the study for it, but
I loved your advice on how to stick with flashcards, which was, I believe it was like, if you said if you're feeling frustrated with flashcards and you want to give up and like go on social media or whatever it is, then you tell yourself, well, I just need to get I can quit on the next flashcard that I get correct. And then I believe that was it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that a lot because I'm learning Hebrew right now, which is like, different alphabet. The pronunciation is not overly clear. Like in German, you know how to pronounce everything automatically. There's no questions. Whereas, I don't know, I guess it's just a little bit, for me, it's Hebrew's hard. So like, I find myself getting frustrated and quitting. Whereas like just having these little carrots of like, oh, I can quit as soon as I get this little success. That was a really good tip. I liked it. Now, can you take me through?
I think keeping in mind the motivation helps like that. Yeah. Sorry. I was just going to say keeping the motivation in mind, I think helps with that. Like just sort of understanding your own quitting points and how you can work around it. That just to add to that point.
Yeah, there's a delay, so I think I'm preemptively speaking. Sorry about that. Can you tell me about? Can you go in a little bit more depth about when you went to Spain? Or I mean, pick any of the countries that you went to. What was your process for like learning the new language? Like, I'm sure did you? Yeah. Please, tell me about it.
Sure. I mean, the thing is that like, we planned the project, so we kind of planned it and announced it before we did it. So there's not as much room for, self-reflection because you're kind of already committing to a bit of a structure when you're doing it. But it's interesting to me because like the process that we used in Spain was different from China and Korea, in part because those languages and cultures are so different. So I think, again, which one we choose would give a different story. So the Spain story is like, I think maybe, if you were to try this with Spanish would be like, it was most successful. And I think that was a couple of factors. So one was that we did have a little bit of prep going in. So I don't want to say that we had zero. We did, I don't know how much we did, but it was about 50 hours. So that's not trivial if you're thinking about it that way. But we did Pimsleur was like our kind of go-to starting point, which I really like Pimsleur just for the beginning parts of a language because it's one of these audiolingual ones where they're like, now say, and then they say some sentence in English and you have to repeat it in the language you're learning. And then they immediately tell you how to say it, like after a short delay. And the idea is that you get a lot of quick feedback on your pronunciation and you actually get used to speaking it. So that when you get there, like those sentences, like you're never going to forget. Like I'm never going to forget like "Donde está el restaurante Bolivar" in Spanish for the rest of my life because of those Pimsleur tapes.
That's
and so we did do a little bit of that. We did a little bit of that to get started. And then, so when we got there in Spain, and I don't know whether this was like, I think it's partly also the Spanish culture and the Spanish people, but I found like it was fairly easy to make friends at a low level of Spanish ability. And it was also something that like in the very beginning, we mostly were meeting other people who were also learning Spanish. But after about a month, we were also meeting Spanish people and hanging out with them. And so some of that I think is cultural. I found the Spanish people were very generous with my low level of Spanish. Like even if they spoke some English, they were like, no, we can speak in Spanish, even when my Spanish was terrible, which has not been my experience with, let's say, in France. I find that, if you speak French kind of badly, there's a little bit like, no, we can speak in English. There's a little bit more of that. So there is some country-specific stuff there. So that helped a lot. And then we were just, I was speaking in Spanish to Vat, who was my roommate at the time. And then we were also speaking Spanish with, this sort of Erasmus group of international students. And then we were later making Spanish friends. And so it was actually one of those genuine like immersion things where you just have lots of friends, you're speaking Spanish all the time. And we were doing some light tutoring. I remember doing a grammar book, and I didn't do that many flashcards in Spanish, but I found it fairly easy to remember the words when people would tell them to me because you'd use them a few times. And then contrast that with like Chinese and Korean, which were like much more of like an academic studying kind of approach. Like we went to China and it was like, oh, wow, this is hard. And then, I'm grinding flashcards, doing this kind of stuff. And like kind of toward the end of China, it was starting to like warm up. We're getting into more what was at the, week 3 in Spain. And so they were very different. And I think that's partly the linguistic hurdles were much more in China. I remember we were like, always extremely frustrated because of our, bad pronunciation of tones, and also because a lot of words don't have an exact one-to-one translation, a lot of the basic words with Chinese. So it's very easy to like use an expression that looks like it translates, but it's like not idiomatic. Like that's not how people would ask that request. And so you would say things, you know, you memorize something and you go to like a store clerk and you ask something and they're like, huh? Like they don't know what you're saying. And so I remember those frustrations early on in China were just like much bigger. And then also just I think the Chinese culture was just a little bit different from what we were used to, you know, where I spent time in Canada, which is a more Western country and Western background. And so, you know, like how do you make friends and what do you do? Like it's very different activities in China than Spain. But I mean, at the end of the day, we also really enjoyed China. And I did end up actually spending much more time learning Mandarin after the trip than I did with Spanish. So it left a strong impression on me. And so I think they were both good, but like really just worlds apart in terms of the actual details. So despite being under this, like, you know, we're going to go 4 countries, each country was sort of its own individual experience that was quite different. And I'm sure if someone else were to do a different trip, they'd have 4 completely different sets of experiences than we did.
Yeah, I definitely want to focus on Spanish because I assume that
Sure.
Asia just presented so many more hurdles than like.
It was a lot of fun
Spanish,
though. I liked Asia. Korea, we were a little tired, but I love Korea too. I wish, you know, by the 4th one, we were a little bit like, oh wow, this is another new language. I think we were getting a little bit more tired of it. But I mean, I love China. China was probably my favorite experience traveling there, which I think, you know, just to be able to, I think learning the languages, sorry, I'm getting off track here, but just to learn the languages itself is
the off track podcast.
To learn the languages itself, the thing that is the most rewarding to me is being able to interact with people that you couldn't have interacted with if you only spoke English. So I think when you learn in what like the second language acquisition, they always separate language acquisition, second language acquisition, and foreign language acquisition, with the idea like foreign languages where, you know, you're in America learning Spanish, and second language acquisition is you're in Spain learning Spanish. And I think when you're in like the language classroom and you're never really needing to use the language, it has this artificiality to it of just like, this is a lot of stuff to memorize and it'd just be easier to do it in English. And it's when you travel and you're in situations where you realize like this person genuinely doesn't speak English, or they speak it very minimally, that like you get to have these experiences that just would have been actually impossible if you hadn't learned the language. Like you would have never met these people, you would have never done these things. And so I felt that, I think, much more in China even than Spain, because Spain had a bit of a European background, and there were quite a few people who spoke English. Not every Spanish person, but quite a few people in the sort of international community. Whereas, you know, we were in Kunming, China, where like once you get outside of the very university core, like there wasn't a single person who spoke English. So like every single experience you're having every day is kind of like totally new, and with someone that you would not have had that experience if you had been on a tour bus or something.
Yes. Okay. Tim Ferriss talks about, I believe he talked about when learning a language, he would take I think it was something like the top 100 or whatever, top X amount of most common words in that language, and then just grind them first. Did you do anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research on vocabulary learning, and I think the basic understanding is that like I think the first 1,000 words, at least in English, represent about maybe like 67%, maybe it's a little bit more of the actual words people use, and then when you get to like 2,000 or 3,000, you're like at 95%. And so I think those first few thousand words are extremely important. I don't always do like the strict frequency list, because then you end up with a lot of words that are like not content words. They're like grammatical words. And so, I mean, English is like but the has no meaning. It's just like you attach it to other words. So it's not something that's like, I mean, you have to use it when you're speaking, but it's not something that like, if you just memorize the definition of the, of, and, on, but, you know, like you're not necessarily going to be able to be fluent there. But I think loosely speaking, focusing on those most frequent words is super important. And I think it's something that I wouldn't follow it strictly, because often you're going to need to learn like that's why we found the no English rule really helpful, because you learn a lot of words on demand. So for instance, we learned the word for recording, like recording video, because we were taking video on the project. So we had to learn that like from the first day in all these places. So like, quiero grabar un video is like a very early thing that we had to learn just because that's what we wanted to do. Whereas record a video is not necessarily something that you would learn early on in any other context. And so I do think I need to communicate this. What's the word for this is often very helpful. But if you are not in a frequent speaking situation, then if you're just like, okay, I want flashcards, then yeah, do the first, 1,000, 2,000. I mean, I think the research was showing that like people who spend a lot of time studying often they only have like mixed ability at even words at like the 3,000 level. Mm-hmm. And so if you were to try to like boost someone's comprehension or understanding or productive abilities, it would be those first few thousand words. And so, if you have to make flashcards, do them from those. And I mean, yeah, if you know a couple thousand words, you're definitely like, if you know a couple thousand words and you have some practice like with the basic grammar so you can speak in sentences fluently, you can deal with like most everyday situations, I would say. There's just going to be occasional words you don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I speak German probably to like, I don't know. I don't really know how many thousands of words I know, but like when it gets to something really esoteric, like a specific thing, like if we're talking about, my friend's an engineer that I talk to in German. And so like, obviously I don't know engineering words, but I can say, oh, that thing, like I can point to the thing and then talk around it and use more basic words. And I think Tim Ferriss said at some point, like you need to get used to talking like a caveman or a cavewoman in my point of view, like, and once you're okay with talking very simply and just saying whatever you can and just getting it out, like that's when language learning becomes really accessible to you, I think.
I mean, I'm totally a proponent of speak badly in the beginning. I know there's a whole school of language learning thought that like don't speak or you're going to make mistakes and then they're going to become permanent errors. I don't believe that at all. But I think that in the beginning, you have this limited, so the skill is like you have this limited vocabulary and then like got to stretch it to make it do work that it wouldn't have to do in my native language because I'd have other words that I could use. And so I think that's often the bigger cognitive challenge is like, how do I work around not having this particular piece of vocabulary in this situation? And I do think when you're in a more relaxed setting, it's often, como se dice, like, how do you say this? Or, you can ask the tutor and because it's kind of just for practice anyways. And then that's the word for this. Oh, okay, that's good. But if you're in a non-learning situation, like, you're hanging out with friends, you don't want to do that too much or it becomes annoying. And so it's very helpful to develop this ability of like, how do you talk around what you don't know? Or how do you talk around words you don't have? And like, how can you describe things? And this can be comical sometimes. I remember a friend telling me like, he spent like 20 minutes in Chinese, like trying to explain what skiing was or something like that. Cause he didn't know the word for skiing and like, the snow and mountain and this kind of thing, so,
I go down mountain on stick.
Like this. Right. But I also think that people, the bigger reason people don't do it is not just this, abstract academic theoretical argument against learning mistakes. I think the reason people don't do it is because you are very used to being judged on your articulateness. And I mean, you are judged on your articulateness, whether you speak a first language or a second language. And you're hesitant to make people have a negative judgment of you. So you're hesitant to have people think you're dumb or stupid because you don't talk in an articulate fashion. And so I think there's that's a big part of the anxiety. And sometimes people externalize that. They'll say things like, oh, well, I don't want I will speak to this person, they're going to have a negative reaction. And I think it's not usually so much that the person's having a negative reaction, but you're kind of negatively judging yourself. Like you're sort of like, oh, I don't sound very smart or I don't, and I think, one of the things that doing this No English Rule really helped with is that this kind of subconscious anxiety, just through exposure, you get rid of it. So like by the time you're in there for 3 weeks, like you don't care that you sound like an idiot because that's just how you sound and you just get through it. And I think that's probably the best way to go forward, is just to not worry about it so much and to do it. And I mean, not to be incorrigible. Like if someone says, oh, don't say it this way, say it that way. Like remember that, not to just be, I don't care about using correct words or correct grammar, but just not to be concerned about, well, I'm not going to say this because I might sound silly or I might sound dumb. And I think that's true of learning in general. I mean, the more you can be comfortable being, bad at something and doing it badly and oh, this person's judging me because I'm not the best skier or dancer or singer or whatever. That's how you get the practice. And so I think designing the project in that way was really beneficial because speaking a new language can be really scary, but when you're forced to do it every day, yeah, even though you're not good, by like a month in, you're not worried about it. Like you don't sweat it at all. You just, I'll just speak badly. I'll just do it,
Yeah. I'm really interested in this, the frame of mind that you have to adopt around difficulty and failure. Like, I think that I have the sense, after reading your book, I have the sense that low self-esteem might be one of the biggest hurdles in ultra learning, or like being too negative on yourself. Because it seems like at the core of ultra learning is embracing difficulty. And not every difficult thing is going to make you learn quickly, obviously. But like, it has to be difficult, I think, in at least most of the time, or a certain percentage of the time. And so I wonder how do you personally deal with constant failure?
I just love that interview question. How do you deal with constant failure given your life? No. I think this is a deep question, because I think that sort of somewhat ironically, like the way you deal with failure is by having this kind of foundation of success that you've built on. So I'm not sure I would recommend the kind of projects I was doing. Like, when I look back at because I'm looking at these projects now, like 10 years, they happened like a decade ago. And you're kind of like, you have a bit of space from it. And you're like, oh man, I was pretty cocky to think I could do that. And like, I'm going to go do that. And like, even after having done it and having personally experienced it, there's a kind of like, what made me so, arrogant that I was going to be like, I'm going to call my shot. I'm going to do this. But I think that was built on this. So for, the MIT challenge, which we haven't really talked about that much, but before doing it was like, I did some tests and I'm like, yeah, I think I could do this. Like, it's going to be hard. I'm going to have to study really hard, but I think I can do it. And with the language learning, the language learning was different because I genuinely didn't know how far we would get, but I had learned French before. So I'd lived in France and I'd done that. And I had gotten the feeling that this immersive approach was the right way to do it. So those were the two things that I felt very strongly about going into it, is that like, I kind of know how to learn a language, and I feel this is the correct way, from like having some immersive episodes interspaced with long periods of kind of non-immersion living in France. I was like, oh no, when you're only speaking French all the time, you're getting tons of exposure. That's where you're getting the growth. So I thought, okay, that's going to be what works. And so, but we really designed it more as an experiment. So I think in that particular case, now when I'm talking about the project, again, it seems like pretty arrogant. And I know like Benny Lewis, who I documented in the book, has often gotten that criticism because he's like, he's calling his shot. He's saying he's going to be fluent in 3 months. And then, so obviously he attracts criticism of people who don't like his proficiency after 3 months or what have you. But I think the idea there when we were approaching it is that, we didn't want to have this like, we're going to reach this bar. We're just going to say like, how far could you get when you were doing it? And it just turned out that I think like in Spain, at least, I felt like we reached a, however you want to define a kind of conversational fluency level, which means that like, one-on-one interactions were generally pretty smooth. Not a total fluency level, like definitely watching Spanish movies or having big group conversations where you're just overhearing them were more challenging. So I wouldn't say that there were zero situations that we had difficulty in. But I mean, after 3 months, I was very happy with the level we reached. But I think that experimental attitude of like, I'm going to go do this, who cares whether it works or not, and let's just see how far we can go, I think is often very helpful. And so I think that the way you deal with failure is that you're trying to redesign the project so that the doing it is a success. So like whether or not you reach some objective level is sort of irrelevant. It's just kind of like, okay, if I stick to this and I see how far I go, let's see what we can do. I think that often is a more successful approach. And so that's been the approach I've tried to do with later projects. So the MIT challenge is like the major exception to that. But I mean, doing the portrait drawing one, I didn't even publish it on the blog because I was like, I have no idea whether I'm going to get good at this at all after, 1 month of time. I was just like, let's do it for a month and see how far I can go. And so I think if you adopt that attitude, then I think, I don't think that you're not thinking of in terms of success or failure because you're not really like setting your expectation on that. And I think that's a major difference from how we often approach things in classrooms where passing and failing is ubiquitous, and strict comparison to other people is also like the name of the game. So when you enter a French class, there is very much a passing threshold, and there's very much the people at the top of the class and the bottom of the class, and you know where you're at in it. And I mean, that's probably great if you're academically inclined and you're in the top of the class, but if you're in the bottom of the class, it can be very dispiriting to just like go in there and be like, well, you tried, but you failed. I think this is why these projects can often be better, because you design them in this sort of idiosyncratic way. So you're not comparing yourself against this benchmark of like, well, this is what you should be doing, and you're not reaching it, kind of thing.
What do you think the ideal like temperament is for an ultra learner? I mean, so for instance, I would say that being organized is probably an organized person is probably going to do better. Be able to schedule their time out. I mean, what attributes would you say are the best for this process?
Well, I think it really depends on the project. I mean, like the language learning project we did was like inherently social, and so I feel like the kind of people who do well with this immersive approach to language learning tend to be confident, mildly extroverted, and a little adventurous, right? That's totally different from I want to master, let's say it's Latin or some language people aren't speaking at home, and then being an introvert and being able to endure like multiple hours of studying at home in your room is maybe a better quality to have. So I don't think there's a universal temperament. Obviously, being smarter helps, but that's true of almost everything in life. So I don't tend to fixate on it, although I also try to be clear that I don't deny that it has relevance to this. I think there's sometimes this kind of debate you get sucked into of where like, well, don't you have to be really smart to do this? And it's like, well, being smart's helpful for everything, but I think it's all about like, well, given that your intelligence is whatever it is, or your aptitude is whatever it is, what's the best you can do, or what's the most optimal way to study this? And so that's always what I try to focus on. So I think that's probably a role, so inherent talent. And then I think also for disposition, I mean, the people I've studied have tended to have somewhat obsessive personalities. And so I feel like I fit in that category, but it's like someone who, you get like unhealthily interested in some particular thing for a period of time. And I don't think that's necessarily something you have a lot of control over, but I do think it's an attribute in this way, because we are talking about difficulties in overcoming them. I think you can do some of that by being conscientious and organized and like sticking to your study schedule. But I mean, for the really hard stuff, I think you just have to really want it. And it's like, that's what you're thinking about all the time. And so, like when we were as I said, like using the language example, like when I was in China, it was like vexing to me, like when I couldn't do certain things. So like, okay, I got to grind this, I got to do that. So it wasn't so much like, I set my schedule up and I set it and forget it. Like I really cared about getting to that outcome. And it was like trying to problem solve and figure out how to do it. And so I think that spirit, that attitude is helpful. And so being like a little bit obsessed, a little bit like you care about this a bit too much, I think helps.
Yeah, very good point. I like how you, I like how adaptive you are with this ultra learning process. Like it's very clear that there isn't just one thing that you do. It's like figure out your personality, figure out your disposition, kind of mold it towards who you are.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that this is I don't want to say it's like a pet peeve of mine, but like sometimes I come on, I'll have interviews or things like that where people like, they want me to present like I have some secret technique that like, that's what I'm pitching, that I have some secret method. And I don't think there's a secret method. I think there's broad principles of what is effective for learning. So we talked about the retrieval idea, but there's lots of things that are like that. And then there's also I think the examples of people who get like really interested in this, and you can draw inspiration from those examples, but obviously the particulars are going to be different in different situations. And so I don't think there's any secret method at all, but I think there's like good ways of doing it, not good ways of doing it. And there's also, I think, people's cases that you can draw upon that you can kind of use as like, okay, I like that as a template. I mean, for me, doing the language project never would have happened if Benny Lewis hadn't kind of created sort of that template of, speaking very early, doing it in this sort of intensive burst over this period of time. Like, it just wouldn't have occurred to me to do it that way if I hadn't seen him before. So I think stories and examples are often very helpful just because they give you a way you might structure something, even if it's not the only option.
I like, you mentioned at some point that you try to spend about 10% of the allocated time. So like if you're going to spend 100 hours for instance learning, you try to spend 10 hours preparing on how to learn this properly, which I really liked because I've always hated school. Like I've just never been academically inclined. And what I think, looking back, what I disliked about it so much was how separate it was from actual skills. Like I do not like sitting down and memorizing things that don't have like a real life consequence for me. Whereas doing a project, I can like, obviously, I learned a computer program at some point, and like it was, I just learned by doing projects. And so I had a goal, and then I could, use whatever tools I needed and learn on the job to like get it done, which was so much more intuitive for me. But I really like what you said about like spend concerted effort. Like 10% is a lot of time to figure out how other people have learned really quickly and how they've learned, well, and what you would enjoy doing.
Yeah. I mean, that's another point that I would make as well. Like, again, kind of contra the secret method advice that like, I think when people are successful learning something, there are different approaches. So there's like multiple approaches for learning a language or for learning programming or business or what have you. But I think the ways that people who are successful learning something are alike is more similar than the failures. Meaning like there's many more ways to fail at learning something than there are to be successful at it. And so if I were to learn like a skill that I don't have that much experience with, the first thing I would be doing is like, how do people learn this when they learn it well? Like, not even in a, what's a secret fast way of learning it? No. What's just the basic way that people learn it when they learn it well? And that's how you get the ideas rolling. So, I mean, like all of the projects I've done were kind of grounded on that a little bit. Like, when do people learn languages well? It seems to be that they do it when they're in a kind of immersive context. And then it's sort of like, how can you engineer that? How can you force that? Similarly, like with the portrait drawing, a lot of it was based on like, well, how do you, like you do a lot of drawing and you're sort of getting progressively more accurate with doing it. And so you get these sort of ideas of like, oh, well, if you did this, maybe you could accelerate this particular process. But that's layered on top of, this is what the subject is, this is what the skill is, this is what you have to do to get good at it. And so I think that has to be the starting point. And I think that's where I think a lot of people trip up, is that if you are learning a skill and you don't know it yet, then you also don't know how it's structured. You don't know what is involved in being good at it. And sometimes you can have, I think, a very misleading idea about what's involved in being good at it. Like, I think, a lot of creative skills, for instance, like if you're being excellent chef or a composer or a writer, novelist, this kind of thing. A lot of people have this idea that like, well, there's this kind of creativity skill that's sort of in the background, and that's what you're sort of have to work on. Whereas a lot of creativity is actually just sort of like a voluminous memory for examples that you're able to like mix, match, and merge and do this kind of thing. And so, people who are good cooks, yes, there is definitely a skill of being a good cook, but a lot of it is like, a lot of recipes, which ingredients go well together, all these little things. And so a lot of what I would do, if you're trying to be a good cook, is that you'd actually like, practice doing a lot of these recipes in this kind of context. Or if you're a novelist, you've read a lot of books, lots of story structures, patterns, and things like this. And so reading is also a very important part there. So I think understanding what's involved in doing the skill, and to try to get that kind of, oh, this is what you have to do when you're actually good at this. It doesn't always tell you the most efficient way to learn it, but it does give you the kind of ground rules of like, well, anyone who would be good at this would have to do X. And that eliminates a lot of options like, well, if you're not practicing this or you're not getting good at this, that's not going to help at all. I think that helps weed out bad strategies. And so that's why I think the research is so important.
Now, I'm really interested in your capacity for deep work. So Cal Newport, and by the way, if you're going to read like books on learning, learning, I would say like Deep Work and Atomic Habits and Ultralearning are like the 3 books that I would pick. They really go together very well. But Cal Newport from Deep Work talks about, he says that most people have a capacity of about like 4 hours for deep work. And I found I strongly top out at about 5. And I've even noticed like if I can do 5 hours of deep work in a day, the next day I'm kind of not very efficient at all. So I'm just wondering how you managed to do 8 hours of deep work when you were doing the calculus experiment way back when. Oh yeah,
I mean, like doing the MIT challenge, there was like weeks for like the first couple months, I was doing maybe 10-hour days. So first of all, I think that some of that is not like there's different gradations of depth, right? So I always felt like watching the lectures, even if I'm watching it at an accelerated pace and taking notes, was lower cognitive effort than doing the practice problems. And I think that, there were classes that were extremely hard and there were other classes where, you do the practice problems. You're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I just got to practice this a few times. And there's other classes where like, what? You don't understand anything. And then those are really draining. So I do think there's different levels to it. I don't know, the whole idea of capacity for effort is super interesting. If I can go on a weird academic tangent here, the sort of main theory that was commonplace until fairly recently was Roy Baumeister had this ego depletion theory, which was this idea that willpower, which is what we're talking about, like self-control, like I'm going to focus on this work for a long period of time, that this self-control faculty was a kind of like almost like an internal resource that we like depleted it with things and then replenished it with things, and that it functioned a little bit like a muscle. So if you kept practicing it, you'd have greater capacity, but this basic dynamic of using it up and replenishing it was there. And this was one of the sort of major social psychology experiments that were kind of like had issues with it with the replication crisis. So in psychology, if you're not familiar, the replication crisis was that a lot of like published scientific results, people run the experiments again and they can't get the results that the original authors were famous for. And they're like, wait a minute, is this even a real thing? And the replication crisis affected this research. So there, not to say that the ego depletion theory was false, but some of the research that suggested it was, drew some questions. So in particular, there was this theory that like blood sugar was really related to it. And like, if you gave people lemonade that had saccharin instead of actual sugar, it wouldn't have the same willpower enhancing effect. And later research showed like actually the brain doesn't use that much glucose when you're exerting yourself that way. And so it doesn't really even make sense neurophysiologically. Anyways, big tangent. And so this is, I think, kind of the modal model that people have in their head. Like it's a folk model of how willpower works. That like you use it, it drains up, and then you need to rest and relax and recuperate it. And the reason that I think there's some doubts about that theory is also because just from like a brain science point of view, it's not obvious why this would happen, like why you would have it used up, because like the brain is kind of always using energy all the time. Even like the visual cortex, the part that's just like on when you open your eyes, uses a ton of energy, but like you don't get tired of looking at things. It's not like something we generally like, like you need to sleep, but it's not because you have to shut your eyes and turn off your vision because it's burning you out. It's actually just this one system in the brain where you feel like, I'm focusing on this math problem for a long time. It's hard. And the other thing that's sort of curious about this result of like why it would work this way is that there's some activities that are extremely cognitively demanding that we really like doing for long periods of time. So like people really like playing video games, but video games are often like maximally cognitively demanding. Like you're engrossed in them, you're in that flow state for long periods of time. So there's people who can play, difficult video games for 14 hours a day, and we don't marvel at their ability to do deep work. work. And so the question is like, why is it math problems? Why is it physics problems and homework and studying and flashcards that we struggle to do for 5 hours, but like, you know, people playing Tetris were able to play it for like 14 hours at a time without break. And so one of the other alternative theories that has come up, and I don't think there's like a new consensus theory of like this is the explanation, but one of the alternative theories is that the effort part of the brain is that there is a central working memory capacity. So there's this sort of central bottleneck that is like holding your attention, and there's a sort of module on that that's always sort of asking, is this the best use of my time? Is this the best use of my time? And so this sort of instinctual module, when you spend a lot of time doing something that, because it's mentally demanding, you can't easily get distracted. Like if your mind is wandering, you fail at the work. So you have to keep focusing on it. And so the longer you spend doing it, the more it's saying, well, maybe I should do something else. Maybe I should do something else. And so I think this kind of ties back to sort of my motivational argument that I think there's certain activities, certain kinds of studying where you can do it longer because motivationally you're really interested in motivationally you want to do it, you find it fascinating. And there's other things where it's like really difficult to do it for even 20 minutes. You know, the Pomodoro technique is a classic example of like, how do I get myself to do this for even 20 minutes? Because motivationally we like have a lot of resistance to doing it. So I tend to think that the issues about deep work and focus are often subtly linked to motivational issues. Like that it's not necessarily just a pure like muscle argument that like you have this much deep work capacity and when it's gone, it's done. It's more that your mind is willing to allow you to do a certain amount of work you find unpleasant. And then after that, it overcomes your sort of ability to have self-control and sit and focus on that, and you have to work on something else. And so I don't know. There's something still true about the ego depletion theory, and this alternative theory is not 100% correct either. But I think that it's interesting to me, at least, that just these examples of like people when they're really intensely engaged in something for long periods of time, it seems to be that like, well, they're just finding the work motivational, like they're in that state where they're enjoying it and they're finding it interesting, and you know, like they have to get to the next level in the video game or whatever it is, that's drawing them forward. And so I think learning can be one of those activities, and that's probably explains why sometimes people are able to do it for long periods of time.
Yeah. That's what I don't understand about, like, for instance, ADHD diagnosis. It's like, so you have ADD, but once again, like, just like you said, you can play video games for 14 hours a day. Or like in the criteria for ADD, it's like the criteria is like you mostly can't pay attention, but sometimes you can you can hyper focus. And to me, it's like, that kind of sounds like everyone, doesn't it? I mean, sometimes you can pay attention, and sometimes you can't. It's like a horoscope. I'm sorry. Sorry.
I'm interrupting you again. I was going to say, like, I always hesitate. Yeah. I always hate whenever we get into like clinical psychology stuff. I'm always a little hesitant to say things because a fun fact: I'm not a doctor or an expert or anything, and you should not be listening to me. But
I'm not a doctor either. But you should listen to me. Yeah. Everything I say is right.
But I think so. One of the things I believe is true about ADHD is it tends to be a spectrum thing. So it's not like there's just some people have it, some people don't. It's like there's this broad continuum of focusing ability, and ADHD is just you're on kind of a tail. And lots of psychological, clinical things are like that. Like it's sort of, it's not. It's like a continuous spectrum. So I think that that's probably true. And I mean, the impulse control is part of this model. So like what you're doing when you're sort of using some part of your brain is kind of like overriding the impulse to do some other activity. And I do think that's a part of learning. I do think it's a part of focusing. And when the activity is just sort of intrinsically rewarding, you don't have to do that control quite as much. And so I think there's probably activities that we are sort of hardwired to enjoy doing because they kind of fit with what our natural environment found appealing. So I think people often get in a flow state where they're intensely absorbed when they're doing, you know, sports or like things like hunting or dancing or some of these activities, whereas they don't when they're doing like calculus or like reading hard texts. Probably because those first things are probably closer, evolutionarily speaking, to like what our ancestors should have been focusing on, you know, like hunting that predator and, you know, doing those sort of like social competitions within the tribe and stuff. Whereas, you know, the guy who's in the savannah a million years ago, who's like doing scribbles on the floor. Like, he's not going to have a lot of children. And so that person is probably not well equipped for that environment. Now, it just happens today that, like, if you're someone who like gets really interested in calculus, there's a job for you at Google. But I mean, that's just a weird situation evolutionarily. And so our sort of motivational hardwiring means that, that's a factor. And I think it's also the case that that they're like, people do vary on that sort of impulse control. And so that's probably also like a module of the brain that, like, you have this intention to do X and you can keep your attention from, like, you can suppress that mind wandering. And so again, people probably vary on that attribute. And it's not obvious even that people who are super good at focusing are good in all situations. I mean, you definitely on the savannah where there's the people sitting around the campfire, you want that one guy who's like watching the horizon and making sure, leopards aren't coming up onto your group. So I think it's probably one of those things where I think ADHD diagnosis and stuff is probably an evolutionary mismatch, that, the environment where those traits were working is maybe not as beneficial given our, like, sit in a desk, learn in school, sit in a desk, do your job kind of environment. And so maybe people who are a little bit more on that end of the spectrum have more difficulties. So I think that's probably true. But again, I'm not an expert and don't listen to anything I'm saying. So
yeah. I guess I just speak from I've never been formally diagnosed, but I totally would be diagnosed with ADHD. And to me, it just seems like exercise is the most beneficial thing I can do for it. And also like deep work really helped me. Like sitting down, turning the phone off, like no music, no distractions, just like sitting down, working for an hour, whatever the time limit is. And also working up to that. Like if I can't do an hour of deep work, which was hard, like do 15 minutes or half an hour or whatever, and just build up. That was, and then obviously
I think it's also
like 4 hours or whatever.
A good point about deep work too is I think it's also helpful to recognize that, like, certain tasks have a natural length of time where if you interrupt them, you're going to have big performance problems. But it's not true across the board. And so, like we were saying about language learning, having the conversation with someone, aside from just scheduling time and doing all of that, especially if you're not in the country that's speaking it, you need to, like, probably have at least half an hour to talk to someone. So you got to make that in your schedule. Whereas doing the flashcards, I mean, you could do a couple of them in like a minute. And so it's much easier to fill like those little random points in time with flashcards than it is to do even like grammar practice, where you actually have to, like, okay, what's this lesson? What's the pattern? There's a little bit of activation. And so I think part of the learning activity as well is like finding which things you need the deep work blocks for and which things you're like, okay, I can do this sort of on the side, or, while I'm waiting in line at the grocery store, and it doesn't have to be deep work to get it done.
I'm wondering if I can ask you for
Sure.
like a specific, so I have a little project planned out. So I suddenly have a few weeks free that I didn't, something fell through, and now I have a bunch of free time, and I think I'm going to just rent out an Airbnb somewhere remote and try to write, like, I was thinking something like one song a day or something like that. I play guitar already. I'm pretty advanced. And I was going to do like instrumental guitar songs, maybe one a day. I might change the goal. I'm not sure. I'm wondering, like, I'm assuming you don't really know much about music, or maybe you know a ton about music.
Not
I'm not
a lot,
sure.
no.
Okay, cool. Just, from your perspective, what would you, how do you think you would structure this experience?
I mean, I think, so first of all, I'm also taking into account that it sounds like you are, you have some background in making music and making songs and stuff, right? So I think there's a little bit of a contrast with, like, how would you learn to make music if you didn't know anything, right? Then there's a little bit of a, like, okay, well, you need to have these prerequisite skills. And so the project itself becomes more complicated. But I think if you are in a situation where, like, well, I already can write songs, but I just don't do it very often, or I find it difficult, then I think a simple project where you're just like, write a song a day, let's say, and this is, you make a schedule for it, that's probably enough. I mean, it doesn't sound like you need to have a lot of other resources or particular training materials to, like, get yourself to do that. I think it would be mostly an issue of like figuring out what are your obstacles to doing that. Like, you know, is it like you're going to run out of ideas? Is it going to be that you don't want to sit down and like, you know, jam around for too long? And like what is it going to be the obstacles, and then try to work that out to the largest extent possible. Try to work out, okay, how could I sort of avoid that obstacle in advance so that I'm not dealing with it in the moment? So I think that would be my only thinking for that. Mm-hmm.
The one that comes to mind, and I'm wondering how you feel, what you think about this one, is I think I'm fine to just put my phone away. Like it'll be this time will be like no phone time. What I think would be the most immediate obstacle is like, I don't think I would necessarily complete the goal of one song a day. Like I might play for a long time, but I don't seem to have that sort of control over myself because it's me. Mm. And I have no one to answer to. So it's like, well, you know, I don't want to finish the song. Maybe I'll continue the song tomorrow. And then perhaps get a little bit like sidetracked, you know, maybe not, maybe feel a little bit bad about it. Like, yeah, I think that sort of area is my general issue, I think.
Well, I mean, I think, again, I think not knowing tons and tons and tons about music to offer you quite music-specific advice, but just from a general creativity advice, like I've definitely been through periods where it's like, okay, I'm going to write an article a day. And I think you can get in that situation where, you know, oh, I like this article, but I'm only halfway. I'll work on it tomorrow. And I think part of the value of doing this sort of project is it's just an experimental constraint. So if you're doing one song a day, then you can't do that. It doesn't mean you couldn't do that in any other situation in life, but just for this particular project, okay, I've got to wrap up whatever I'm doing. And whether that makes this song short or unfinished or unpolished or whatever, I'm going to move on to the next one. And sometimes I think that can be beneficial. I think sometimes you use these kind of constraints on your workflow to push you to do things in a way that you wouldn't normally do. So I know for me, and this is, I don't know whether this is like something bad about me and my writing, but like my writing, often I have my most successful articles in my periods where I write prolifically and I'm like doing the least research and preparation for the actual articles. Whereas when I like sweat over them a lot, maybe sometimes those articles, maybe they also do well, but I'm just maybe not making as many of them. So those periods are less successful for my website. And so, you know, for me, that just shows my tendency is to like hold it back. Like, oh, let's not publish this yet. Let's do a little bit more research. Let's, you know, finesse it a little bit more. Whereas probably just if my end goal was to be more popular, I should just be writing more. I should just be publishing more. And so I think just thinking about the project that way of just like having it as a constraint that, okay, well, you know, whatever you're done at the end of the day, that's it. That's the song, and you work on a new one. That could be productive. Just for forcing you to write songs in a different way, or forcing you to create music in a way that's not what you're maximally comfortable with.
I like that. I like that a lot. It's very good advice. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your life right now. I mean, you mentioned before that you're a father of 2 kids. How, and obviously you have a wife, you have a business. How often do you spend ultralearning nowadays?
Well, again, I think for me, the learning has become so integrated with my life and what I'm doing that it's not like I'm not doing what I was doing earlier where it's like, okay, for a year, I'm doing this full time. And so it's more like, I don't know, most recently, like for the last year and a half or so, I've been doing research for an upcoming book. I won't talk about it too much just because the details aren't all finalized yet. But I mean, I think I probably read about 150 books and maybe like 500-600 scientific papers to read it. So, I mean, it was a lot of material to get through, but it wasn't a ultra-learning project in the sense of like, I'm going to learn this and do this. It was just kind of a byproduct of what I was doing. And so I've done that. And there's been other situations where I've had to, you know, learn a lot in a short period of time for something else. But I feel like now I think I'm a little bit more utilitarian than I used to be just because I have more time constraints. So I tend to pick projects that are a little less whimsical, maybe to my detriment, but I tend to pick things where it's sort of like, okay, this is what I need to do. And I fit it in and work on it. But I think a lot of the principles that I found helpful for these other projects, like they still apply here, you know, and I'm always trying to adapt them to the things that I have to learn these days.
That's very interesting because I've only really just thought about this, but you're also a celebrity, I suppose. Like you're a celebrity amongst a certain crowd of people, and a very good crowd at that to have. But I suppose that for you, the learning also it's beneficial when the learning is also paired up with entertainment value.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I think I got this like negative YouTube comment once with this guy. They were commenting on, I think it was the MIT challenge, that project I did. And the person said, well, this is obvious attention-seeking behavior and blah, blah, blah. And they were kind of like reproaching me. And the thing that kind of caught me about it was that like, well, like, yeah, of course, this is what I do for a living, is that like I'm a public figure who learns things and talks about it, like, like that is what I do, right? And so, a lot of the projects I did were kind of designed in ways to make them more interesting to talk about. I'll put it that way, right? And so, when I talk about the MIT challenge, for instance, like the point I wanted to make with the challenge is that like there's a lot of college material that is important for learning, valuable job skills that you can learn just for free online. Like you don't have to go to school and pay a lot of money to learn it. It's there and you can do it. But I obviously did it in this 1 year time frame because I thought I could, and also because I thought it would be like more interesting to talk about. But it's funny because, sometimes people don't maybe see that aspect of it. And so there's some constraints that I'm working under when I'm working on some of these public projects. They're a little artificial just because they're done so that it can be, more intriguing. Like there's no reason that the portrait drawing thing had to be done in a month. Like it could have definitely been done over a year. It just was more interesting to do it over a month. So I think, I purposely tried to distance myself from that when writing the book Ultralearning, because that feature of myself, or even people like Benny Lewis, who have also kind of, although he did do a lot of the language learning before he became a full-time blogger, but like people who have this kind of public learning persona, like, yeah, it's totally artificial that you have to do it under certain constraints like this just because it's attention grabbing. But I think that, I hope what these projects do is that, the artificiality is an excuse to start talking about it. And I mean, I really do enjoy learning it. That's why I do this with my life. And so, even the projects that I don't talk about, I'm really interested in. Like, as I mentioned, the most recent one I've been involved with has not been one that I'm like documenting as publicly, but my hope is that it's going to mature into something that, it's a good book that's useful to read for people. And so I think it's important to sort of separate, like, okay, what are the constraints that's chosen as a constraint because it's a really important constraint that you'd have for learning, versus that was chosen as a constraint because it made it more interesting to talk about after.
And it's inspirational as well. I mean, the fact that you can learn calculus in a week, or learn an MIT course in a year, just means that, like, for a regular university student, yes, you can learn. I mean, this guy did it in a year. You can do it in 3 or 4 years or whatever it is. Like, you just need to adopt these principles. I think, there's a huge inspiration factor. Ultralearning was super inspirational for me. It just made me think of all these. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's like, I like the thought experiment idea applied to things, because as I say in the book, like my motivation for doing these projects is not come out of nothing. It's from seeing other people do things that I thought that was really cool. And so I kind of wanted to be part of it. So it's not like I just sort of decided one day to do these things. It was, the language learning project was very much inspired by Benny Lewis. And I really liked his projects. I liked watching them. They were excited. They got me excited about learning languages, and they got me excited about certain approaches to language learning that I was not applying when I was learning French and that I was struggling with. And so I think that's something that, the MIT challenge was very closely inspired by Steve Pavlina's attempt to do a 3-semester computer science math degree, and also Josh Kaufman's personal MBA project. So, I mean, I owe a debt of gratitude to those people who inspired me. And so I don't think most people ought to do the kinds of projects that I do exactly the way that I do them, but I hope that they'll be inspired to find something from them that they'll want to take and maybe apply to something that they're interested in learning.
Absolutely. And just to reinforce, I've said this before, but like, if you read Scott's book, it doesn't mean you need to immediately do the ultra marathon. Like, just read it. Like, I promise you'll find ideas that will fit into your everyday life. You don't have to make many changes, and like, it'll just show you how to learn better. It's excellent. Now, I want to go back to language for a second, because I have met so many people who just learned language from like watching TV and playing video games especially English. I mean, so many people online say like, and I just wonder how much credence you give to this idea of like kind of just passively consuming tons of media in that language. Like, did you do much of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think that approach is particularly useful for the constraints that I was working under with the project. So like, if you're doing something over 3 months, I don't know how you would do it that way. But that's not to say that, you know, everyone's working under those particular constraints. So there's this, like, to go again, academic tangent, there's a really popular idea in language learning from Stephen Krashen. So he is this very big second language acquisition theorist, and he proposed what he called the input hypothesis, which was that comprehensible input, this idea that like input that you can understand. His idea was that it should be like +1 above your level. So the idea is like there should be something new in it that you're learning. So it's not just only things that you've already mastered, but it should be understandable. So the idea meaning that like if you're just listening to the radio and you don't understand anything anyone's saying, you're not going to learn the language. It has to be comprehensible. But the idea is that if you just had enough comprehensible input, that would be all you need. So if you would gain the ability to speak, you would speak grammatically and whatnot just through comprehensible input. And I think this hypothesis has had considerable influence. I mean, I think Krashen was largely pitting his hypothesis against the then dominant at the time kind of like master the grammar rules. So like, you know, that sort of schoolroom learning. Maybe also a little bit against the behaviorist learning method. So I mentioned like Pimsleur, which is one of these audiolingual ones, but this idea that like you just memorize these sentences and you say them again and again, and like that would lead to speaking. I think it's very helpful in the beginning, but it doesn't lead to fluency in the end. But I don't know. I think there's some controversy over it. So I'm a little bit of an outsider in this field. So I know some people still like the input hypothesis, and they think that, you know, Krashen was like mostly right, but there's like a few little like, you know, maybe asterisks next to that. And then there's other people who think, oh no, he was wrong about that. So one of the major criticisms of him was that he ignored output. So Meryl Swain, she was a Canadian researcher. She found that in language immersion schools in Canada, where people are doing French immersion classes, so these are English native students who are doing all of their coursework in French, and found that even though after they're children, they've spent 7 years, so they're kind of like in a situation where if you were a child and you were 7 years of immersion in another country, the expectation would be that you would be pretty fluent in that language. Nonetheless, had like some sort of marked grammatical deficiencies. And so she hypothesized that it was partly because they weren't being asked to speak that much. They had very few, very minimal chances to produce language. And so she thought that, you know, she had this comprehensible output to sort of contrast the input hypothesis, that this was important. I know Michael Long had this idea that there was interaction was important. And there's other theories of language learning that say that, you know, maybe that production is important for building fluency and stuff. My personal feeling is that I think that the input is very important sort of in the long run for getting a feel for the language, this sort of implicit learning process. And so people who are going to spend years and years and years consuming English media, you're going to pick up quite a bit. But I also think that the research sort of shows that once you reach a certain age, so once you get a little bit older, it's harder to pick up certain aspects of grammar, certain aspects of pronunciation without some explicit practice, without some level of like you do it and you get feedback. And so because of this, I would be somewhat doubtful that, you know, the prescription ought to be you should just spend lots and lots of time consuming media. That being said, though, I think especially if it's comprehensible, it's media you can actually understand, you can go quite far with that. So I'm not totally against that. And I think I would question the passive part, because I think if you're watching media in another language and you to understand it. Like, it is active and it is effortful. I mean, most people don't do that. I mean, when you're learning a second language, you're asking people to tell you what it is in English and this kind of thing. You're not actually using the language. So it's not necessarily that active passive distinction. But I think, the approach that I've often favored is more of the, like, you're in an unfamiliar place, you want to get to a conversational level relatively quickly. And I think that the approach that emphasizes interaction, speaking, you memorize some vocabulary on flashcards, you memorize some on grammar. I think it's a little bit faster in the beginning, definitely, than an approach where it's just sort of like, you're not getting any lessons, you're just passively absorbing it. No instruction, no deliberate practice. I think that may work if it's a really long period of time, but I think it probably wouldn't work if you were trying to do it over like a couple months or something.
Would you like put subtitles on? I mean, I guess it depends on how fluent you are, but yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's hard to say. Like, this is again why I like conversations as a medium for learning, because it's an adjustment process. Like, the person you're talking to dynamically adjusts their level of language to enable communication. And so it's much easier to, like, basically all conversations with a reasonable conversation partner can be made to be at your level, whereas native level media is just not in general. It's not in general the case that it's at your level. So it's very often much above your level. I think if you're forced to do that, like, I think, again, Stephen Krashen's idea was this like graded readers, like you give kids readers that use a more limited set of vocabulary so that it would be comprehensible. But if you're doing just like you want to watch movies or read books that are not made for language learners, then I think doing things repeatedly is often beneficial. So you could like watch it maybe once without the subtitles and then watch it with the subtitles, or vice versa. You watch it with the subtitles and then you watch it again without the subtitles. I think that can often help because you kind of remember the meaning and then you do it again. One thing I found really beneficial was to watch shows that were dubbed in the language that I'd already watched in English. So I remember when we were in Spain, I watched, I think I downloaded an entire thing of it was like Star Trek, but it was all dubbed in Spanish. And it was like, I remembered the episode, so I could easily follow it, even though if it was like a native Spanish show that I'd never seen before, like missing a few key vocabulary points, I would have lost the plot. I would have been like, oh wait, what are they talking about now? And it would have been a frustrating experience. So I think watching things dubbed in a language can be beneficial. That's usually easier to get with some languages than others. Like, there's lots of material dubbed in Spanish. There's very little that's dubbed in Chinese. Like, they usually just do subtitles, so it didn't work as well there. But I think that's one way you can overcome this, like the language being at the wrong level for you, the material.
That's a fantastic point. That really appeals to me, the idea of doing, also specifically for my level of German, like just the German show, and then because then, like you said, it creates the road towards understanding, and then afterwards listening to dubbed. I think as well there's that like,
or with subtitles, yeah.
Subtitles, yeah.
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes as well, like, again, I think part of the difficulty with just watching it with subtitles is that your attention is on the English subtitles and you can't simultaneously process the English text, and like you don't have enough cognitive bandwidth to in real time process the English text and the native language text. And so because they're redundant, your brain exclusively focuses on the English text and you just basically ignore what they're saying, which is why I think very few people become fluent watching TV shows with subtitles on, because your brain is paying attention to the language you already understand, not the language you don't understand. But if you don't have any subtitles and you don't understand anything they're saying, it's also very difficult to process it, again, if it's much above your level, because there are some cues you can pick up. But I mean, if you're watching a legal procedural drama in another language and they're using legal terms, like, you're not going to infer those just by moving the characters around and stuff. So in those cases, I think, like, again, you could watch the show first with the subtitles so you know what is happening in the show, and then the second pass, you're paying attention to the language. Or you could do it the reverse, where you watch it first in the other language, try to guess what's happening, and then watch it in English. And because you've watched the show again, it's easier to kind of like, oh, this is the word for this is the word for this, the second pass. But I think, repeated viewings is often one way to overcome that. If you're watching the same show a couple times, then like, again, you get more each time, which is, that's something kids do a lot when they're reading, or like, little kids like to watch the same television shows over and over and over again. And I bet it's because each time they're getting something new, whereas an adult gets everything from it the first time they watch it. So it's boring the second time.
Yeah, very interesting. What's sticking in my mind is how appealing it sounds to have that like wondering what something means for me. So like watching it in just straight German first, and then like having that curiosity of like, I wonder what happened there, or I wonder what he said, and then like building that road, and then being able to figure out what it is the next time. That sounds really fun to me personally.
Sorry. I was just going to give one last note on that point. Like for me, I found like I was watching some Chinese shows this way, and like I'd watch it in Chinese, and then when it would be a hard part, like I don't know what's going on, you just like you rewatch that 1 minute with the English subtitles, and then often like clues you in on key vocabulary for that episode, and then you don't have to go through like the whole thing and watch the whole thing again. You can kind of like patch up and stuff. So then like, as long as you're following what's going on, it's a lot easier the learning is more efficient. If you're learning and you don't understand anything that's going on, you're probably not learning very much. It's frustrating and you're not learning very much. So you really want to avoid doing that.
We have 10 minutes left, by the way. And I wanted to ask a little bit about your business. So as far as I understand, you, obviously you have books and you provide courses for people. Is that what you meant by your business? Is that the whole thing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, it doesn't sound like very much. I mean, it's certainly not. We're not Google.
Oh, it sounds like a lot.
Company, but we have.
I bet it's a bunch.
But yeah, we have a few employees, and there's a number of contractors that work with us on a part-time basis because, like website, you need server admins, and you need graphic designers, and you need people who edit videos, and all sorts of things like that.
Are you available for people who want to spend a big chunk of money and just consult with you for a certain amount of time?
So I don't usually do personal consulting, and I don't do it as like a paid activity. But I always like, if you're interested in doing like an Ultralearning project and you're very interested in it, like you should email me, because I often am able to like, not usually like one-on-one coaching where I can like sit down with you and study X or something, especially if I don't know what it is you're trying to learn. But I always like interacting with people. So if you are working on a project and you think like, this is exactly what I'm doing, don't hesitate to email me, because I love to hear from people who are learning things and are excited about learning things.
Oh, that's so generous of you with your time. You have such a, I bet you have an excellent community. Like you have this very specialized niche of people who are just interested in like learning as much as possible. So you really have, you've attracted this tiny margin of people at the top who are like hyper focused, obviously pretty smart, I would imagine, very curious people. Have you had, I'm kind of curious about what your experience with your fan base is.
I've been doing this for a long time. Like it's been almost, it's like getting close to 20 years now. So I feel like I've gone through lots of different phases, and I've always been, I've had, I don't do as many reader meetups anymore, just because I don't travel quite as much. And usually when I am traveling, like I've got my wife and my kids, so it's a little bit harder to like I'll just go to a coffee shop and meet with a bunch of strangers. But I used to meet up with people more often at like meetups, and I was always very pleasantly surprised by the people who chose to read me. Like it's always an interesting group of people who were, they're often high achievers, but just from very diverse backgrounds. So there's not like a type of person, I think, that reads my blog. It's, you've got every single type of person from different walks of life with different pursuits and different interests. And the thing that I always find very gratifying is when you meet people where like you think, oh, this person's more impressive than me, like I should be reading them, and they're reading your blog. So it's always very flattering when you meet people who you admire them, and then they're writing messages to you.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, if somebody is learning about you for the first time, where should they go first? You have quite a few products available.
Well, I always recommend people join the blog and the newsletter because, first of all, it's free. And secondly, you get a sense of my writing and what I talk about. So scotthyoung.com is my website, and you can join my newsletter. If you're interested in these kind of topics about learning and you would like them in a more condensed and edited format, then my book, Ultralearning, you can get on Amazon, wherever books are sold. You can listen to the audiobook. And I sort of walk through a lot of these projects in more detail, in more specific, like this is the principle, these are the studies, a little bit less ranty. And then, we have also, for people who are joining our newsletter, we have this 5, at least at the time of this recording, we have this 5 ebook giveaway, which is based on some of my previously published writing. So if you're interested in, we have guides to sort of like aspects of learning. We have a guide to memory, a guide to working memory, a guide to motivation, where I sort of review some of the research and talk about some of the basic principles. And so it might be useful to you if you're interested in embarking on a deeper project. And those are also free for people who join the newsletter.
Great. I go out, every single one of you, and buy Ultralearning. I promise you. You will like the book. You will get something out of it. Hey, Scott, this has been like one of my favorite podcasts. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah. All right. I'll talk to you later. Good luck with your learning.
All right. Thank you.